In autumn 1944, American forces smashed themselves against Hitler's West Wall, a 400-mile fortress of concrete and steel defending Germany's border. The 22nd Infantry Regiment alone suffered devastating losses in weeks of futile assaults. Some bunkers required multiple bloody attacks before falling. Boys from small American towns died for yards of German soil. This was just one campaign in a war that devoured between 70 and 85 million human beings. From Leningrad's 872-day siege, where civilians ate wallpaper, paste and leather, to Guadalcanal's jungle hell, where empires bled, to Okinawa's kamikaze-swept waters, where death fell from the sky, the Second World War became humanity's most industrialized killing machine. Tonight, we'll take you inside 5 battles that didn't just claim millions of lives, they decided the war's outcome. You'll discover how Hitler's impregnable fortress became his funeral shroud, how Leningrad's starving defenders outlasted the Wehrmacht, how a Pacific island most Americans had never heard of broke Japan's expansion, how suicide warfare pushed both sides toward unthinkable weapons, and how the Eastern Front's collapse sealed Nazi Germany's fate. These weren't just battles. They were crucibles where blood, steel, and sacrifice forged the world we inherited. The decisions made in these killing fields echo through every headline today. The first killing field that decided the war's fate wasn't a city or a harbour. It was a 400-mile wall of concrete and steel that Hitler believed would save the Reich. By early September 1944, about 13 weeks had passed since D-Day. Allied forces had fought their way across 300 miles of Norman hedgerows, shattered German resistance at the Falaise Pocket, and now stood before Hitler's ultimate insurance policy, the West Wall. What lay ahead wasn't just another battle. It was a confrontation with the most formidable defensive system ever constructed. Stretching like a concrete cancer across 400 miles of German territory, the West Wall ran from the southwest corner of the Netherlands to the Swiss border. An estimated 22,000 pillboxes, troop shelters, and command posts formed an interlocking web of death. Each position supported the others. Each bunker channeled attackers into killing zones. Where nature failed to provide obstacles, German engineers had planted parallel rows of concrete pyramids called Dragon's Teeth, tank traps that could stop a Sherman dead in its tracks. Hitler had begun building this monster in the 1930s as both a defensive system and a political signal to France, whose Maginot Line faced it across the border. The project became a massive propaganda tool designed to intimidate Britain and France into making concessions to Nazi demands. After conquering France in 1940, the wall had been stripped of its guns and left to rot. Only when the Allies broke out of Normandy did Hitler realize his mistake. Hundreds of thousands of civilians, forced laborers, and Hitler Youth were thrown into a desperate race against time. Working like demons through August and September, they repaired bunkers, installed new weapons, and laid fresh minefields. The concrete was cracked, the steel rusted, but the wall still possessed teeth. More importantly, it had something the Allies didn't expect: defenders who knew they were fighting for the survival of the Reich itself. German 7th Army's decimated remnants had streamed back from Normandy in chaos, but once they reached the wall's protection, they transformed. No longer fleeing refugees, they became defenders encased in fortifications they believed impregnable. Field Marshal Walter Model, Hitler's fireman, commanded Army Group B in the northern sectors. General Hermann Balk's Army Group G controlled the center. Even Heinrich Himmler's SS troops manned southern positions. but the Allies had problems far worse than German concrete. General George Patton paced his Third Army headquarters like a caged tiger, his face purple with rage. His tanks sat empty at the Moselle River, bone dry after their lightning advance across France. "I'm going through that wall like shit through a goose," he'd promised reporters just days earlier. Now his army was stranded, watching precious days slip away while German reinforcements poured into the wall. The fuel crisis wasn't accident, it was policy. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had made a controversial choice that many historians still debate. Rather than supporting Patton's drive toward the Rhine, he'd allocated most available fuel to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group for a thrust through Belgium and the Netherlands. Operation Market Garden was supposed to end the war by Christmas. Instead, it would condemn infantry to months of slaughter against German concrete. Montgomery's offensive proved a tragic disaster. Antwerp fell on September 4th, but German resistance was far stronger than expected. The Germans blocked the Scheldt estuary, making Antwerp useless for Allied supply purposes. When the airborne drops at Arnhem failed catastrophically, on September 26th, 7,000 Allied troops killed, wounded, or captured for a bridge too far. Eisenhower's northern strategy had stalled. Now autumn approached with its promise of rain, mud, and German reinforcement. The only option left was the hard way, head-on assault against the West Wall's strongest positions. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Prussian aristocrat Hitler both needed and despised, had returned to command Germany's western defences. Despite his contempt for Nazi ideology and Hitler's military interference, Rundstedt understood the wall's true purpose. It wasn't designed to stop the Allies permanently. It was built to buy time for mobile reserves to arrive, time for counterattacks, time for Germany's miracle weapons to enter production. The reality matched the propaganda far longer than anyone expected. On September 13th, 1944, Colonel Charles Lanham gathered his 22nd Infantry Regiment officers in the Eifel Plateau region of Western Germany. His plan was textbook simple. 3 battalions would assault the West Wall pillboxes sited on the Brandscheid Heights, break through, and open the way for the entire 4th Division to surge toward the Rhine. 3rd Battalion led the attack, using terrain to mask their approach from German defenders. Artillery hammered German positions, while infantry advanced with flamethrowers to burn out the bunkers. At first, there was no reaction from the wall. The Germans were waiting for the perfect moment. When it came, it was devastating. Mortar fire plunged down on the advancing troops like steel rain. German MG 42 machine guns, the Allies called them Hitler's buzzsaw for their distinctive sound, began their deadly chatter. Men keeled over one after another until they lay scattered across the hillside like broken dolls. The wounded were dragged back down the hill while cries for medics echoed across the battlefield. Lanham realized his men were on the brink of breaking. Drawing his pistol, he fired 2 shots in the air and screamed at his reserves to advance. Eventually they went, picking their way around the bodies still lying on the slopes. But 3rd Battalion's assault on Brandscheid revealed a truth that would haunt the campaign. This wasn't a sleepy village, but a fortress bristling with pillboxes and defended by battle-hardened SS troops. The battalion dug in and tried again the next day. And the next. For 2 weeks, they threw themselves against German concrete. They got nowhere. Meanwhile, the 22nd Regiment attempted another approach, reducing German bunkers one by one in a methodical siege. This was no small enterprise. When Germans refused surrender demands, tank destroyers drove up to steel doors and blasted them in at point-blank range. It was dangerous work for the attackers, but it worked. Survivors emerged from the wreckage, most badly injured. The dead were piled up inside, like cordwood. Before long, casualties mounted to around 800 men. Some died when Germans launched counterattacks out of their pillboxes. Roughly half the 1st Battalion were killed or wounded. Only 2 officers survived. Many casualties weren't physically injured, but developed combat fatigue, the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd seen too much death. Eventually, Lanham was forced to call off the attack. The weather worsened, German defences showed no signs of weakening, and nothing had been gained. The vital roads leading out of the Eifel region to the Rhine remained under German control. The wall remained intact. The next attempt came from Luxembourg, where the 28th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Bloody Bucket for their red keystone shoulder patch and reputation for record casualties, prepared to face their greatest test. Under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army, they advanced against crack German forces, including the 2nd SS Panzer Division. As troops crossed the minefields, Germans saturated the battlefield with mortar and machine gun fire. Within a week, casualties reached around 1,500 killed and wounded. One company suffered catastrophic losses and was effectively wiped out in the fighting. The unit disappeared into the German killing machine with devastating completeness. Despite this fearsome defence, the Bloody Bucket Division pushed forward on a narrow front and captured several high points. But these gains proved worthless when the 2nd SS Division still held the low ground. On September 16th, the division scored a notable first. They breached the West Wall in what official history described as a pencil-like penetration. In practical terms, it meant little. The devastating losses had taken the heart out of their efforts. "I'm going through the wall like shit through a goose," General Patton had promised. When his enforced halt at the Moselle finally ended on September 5th, Patton ordered the 12th and 20th Corps to seize Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, as a prelude to breaking through the West Wall and crossing the Rhine. Patton envisaged no serious difficulty. The section of wall immediately facing 3rd Army was manned by 7 weak infantry divisions and a panzer brigade of the German 1st Army. Also in the vicinity were 7 understrength divisions of the German 19th Army. Hardly impressive opposition. Still, this was one of the best defended parts of the West Wall, and Field Marshal Model was in overall charge. Elements of 3rd Army set out for the Merthyr River near Nancy on September 11th. Despite heavy German resistance, they crossed the river and took Nancy on September 15th. But then came a 4-day halt through lack of supplies and provisions, plus the onset of bad weather. The delay gave Germans the opportunity to regroup and concentrate reserves from 1st Army at Chateau Salins, blocking one of the main routes to the Rhine. 3rd Army had lost the initiative. 5th Panzer Army hit them with a series of major strikes at Patton's 4th Armoured Division. The contest continued for 10 days in a regular pattern. Germans attacked under cover of fog, fought vigorous engagements with forces aided by aircraft of the 19th Tactical Air Command when weather permitted. Eventually, wrecked panzers littered the battle area. Germans were down to only 25 tanks and wisely withdrew. In all, they lost around 280 tanks and suffered approximately 3,000 casualties with the same number taken prisoner. Losses were fewer, around 600 casualties, but almost non-stop fighting over the past 2 months had exhausted them. They were retired from the Lorraine area on October 12th to rest, recoup, and refit. The west wall remained untouched. 9 days later, to his chagrin, Patton lost the honor of making the first permanent breach in the fortifications. It happened at Aachen, a historic city on the German border with Belgium and the Netherlands. Aachen wasn't unusually strong, and though it formed part of the West Wall, its position held no strategic significance. Nevertheless, capturing Aachen, the first appreciable German city the Allies had encountered, could provide an important boost to morale. More importantly, it was Charlemagne's ancient capital, making it a symbol of German power and prestige. Dealing with Aachen fell to Courtney Hodges' First Army. German resistance was so ferocious that it became impossible for First Army to perform both tasks simultaneously, surrounding the city while pushing eastward toward the Rhine. Hodges had to choose, and he chose to assault Aachen. Hitler fully realized Aachen's importance and issued his usual orders to the 5,000 Germans defending it: fight to the last man, never retreat, die if necessary. The casualties that resulted from such fanatical defense had already proved so high that Hodges attempted to cut short the proceedings. He issued a surrender ultimatum on October 10th. As he no doubt expected, it was refused. Hodges now ordered his forces to attack with a systematic plan of destruction. They would demarcate the battle area by artillery and mortar fire, dominate main thoroughfares and intersections with machine guns, and move infantry, tanks, and tank destroyers along side streets. All the while, they would maintain maximum fire to ensure no German could escape. While defenders were held in this fashion, buildings would collapse around them, burying them in the ruins. The initial bombardment was delivered by 12 artillery battalions, which plastered the city with 10,000 rounds in 2 days. Fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Command dropped over 160 tons of bombs in the same period. Still, heavy fighting raged inside Aachen for the next week. Tank destroyers hammered away with heavy caliber fire. They used powerful 155mm artillery pieces to blow entire buildings apart. The 155 worked on Germans like a terror weapon. Later, the German commander in Aachen, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, condemned it as barbarous and called for it to be banned. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, commander of the 2nd Battalion, had quite another description for the 155, quite spectacular and satisfying. By the afternoon of October 21st, Daniel's 2nd Battalion had secured the business areas of Aachen and were pushing westward when they learned the fight was over. Contrary to Hitler's orders, the garrison of Aachen had surrendered. The city captured around 1,000 prisoners. According to their own reports, Germans had suffered approximately 5,000 casualties, quite possibly many more. Losses were roughly 1/10 of that number, most among the assault troops. After the battle, only around 20% of Aachen's buildings were left standing. Even before Aachen's capture, the 9th Infantry Division of Hodges' First Army was ordered into the Hurtgen forest southeast of the city to clear it as security for another major effort against the West Wall. The Hurtgen was a man-made forest covering around 200 square miles. There were few roads. It was difficult fighting country, certainly for tanks and armoured vehicles. They expected only light resistance. They were catastrophically wrong. Within weeks, the 9th Infantry Division had suffered approximately 4,500 casualties for an advance of less than 2 miles. The battle in the forest now took on the proportions of a major struggle, and one in which Germans always seemed one jump ahead, In November, Hodges ordered the 28th Bloody Bucket Infantry Division, the same unit that had suffered devastating losses at the wall, to advance through the forest to seize the high ground at Schmidt. Schmidt lay north of important dams on the Rohr River. Rain and fog intervened to cause delays, giving Germans time to prepare. During subsequent fighting, they lost around 6,000 casualties in one of the most costly actions they fought in the entire war. An action, initially intended as an easy ride, had quickly turned into a nightmare. The forest floor was thickly sown with anti-personnel mines. Shells bursting high in the treetops fell down in showers of deadly metal fragments onto soldiers picking their way through a mess of broken branches and slippery leaves. As winter wore on, there was rain, mud, sleet, and snow. It was all too easy to get lost in the tangle of trees and stumble into ambushes. German defence had an extra purpose beyond mere tactical advantage. The top-secret watch on the Rhine, the deliberately misnamed offensive due to take place in the Ardennes in December, could have been jeopardised if forces managed to cross the Ruhr River. The Ruhr itself was of great importance to Germans. If the river was crossed now or in the future, they could be isolated by floods caused by opening the Ruhr dams. Ideally, flooding might prevent them crossing at all. The cost on both sides was staggering. Germans lost approximately 2,000 killed and injured, and 1,200 taken prisoner. Losses were even greater, roughly 4,500 men killed, wounded, or missing. November 1944 went on as September and October had begun. Massive assaults, accompanied by fighter-bomber attacks, did nothing to break German resistance. The resistance was so powerful that the Bloody Bucket Division lost around 40% of its strength in 7 days. On November 15th, 1,200 flying fortresses of the US 8th Air Force flew from the Netherlands to soften up the enemy for the 84th Division at Gielenkirchen, north of Aachen. The result was the same, a fearful battle of attrition in which infantry suffered so many losses they were unable to continue. December 1944 found forces battering themselves against the West Wall for 3 months. Despite victory at Aachen, they were getting nowhere. The Hürtgen Forest became a microcosm of this failure. After the Bloody Bucket Division was withdrawn, another armoured division and 4 more infantry divisions were sent in, only to be shredded in their turn. None lasted more than 2 weeks before being replaced by the next. The ultimate responsibility for breaking this impasse lay with General Eisenhower. After such a long time, so many losses, and so many failures, he might well have felt his job was on the line. Even worse, the outcome of the war could be in the balance. Inside their defences, Germans had proved too strong to shift. Instead, Eisenhower sought to lure them out of their fortifications so they could meet them on open ground where they had a better chance to prevail. Eisenhower laid a trap, the so-called Ghost Front in the Ardennes, where defences were thin and Germans might fancy their chances. In fact, Eisenhower had 14 armoured divisions waiting in the wings to fall on them once they emerged. In the meantime, frontal attacks on the wall continued. There was no major breakthrough, but there were some gains. Forces captured important crossroads, leading to defences in the Hürtgen Forest and the Victi crossroads north of Monschau. The west wall itself was penetrated to a depth of 1,200 yards. On December 16, 1944, Germans appeared to fall for Eisenhower's trap. They came out of their fortifications, but not to assault with understrength manpower. In one of the worst cases of bad luck and coincidence in military history, Eisenhower's trap was preempted by the Ardennes offensive, the last-gasp initiative by 24 German divisions to throw back the Allies and possibly win the war. The Allies never imagined that at this late stage, Germans were capable of mustering such a force. But the Ardennes offensive didn't last long. After initial successes, fuel supplies ran out. In early January 1945, it was all over. On January 16, 1945, 8 days after the Ardennes offensive ended, British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery took their turn at cracking the West Wall. Their target was the Heinsberg salient, around 20 miles long, defended by 3 lines of fortifications, continuous trenches, and weapons pits covered by barbed wire and liberally sown with mines. Germans had 2 infantry divisions in the salient, with 156 guns and 18 assault guns, all spread over muddy terrain difficult and dangerous to traverse. Montgomery's forces consisted of 2 infantry divisions and the very tough 1st Commando Brigade. General Patton was not happy about Montgomery, his hated rival, gaining the honour of being first to reach the Rhine. At the end of January 1945, Patton, with help from General Bradley, persuaded Eisenhower to agree to an armoured reconnaissance in the Eifel region that would take his forces across the rivers, Auer and Sauer, to close in on the West Wall. The term armoured reconnaissance was somewhat vague, and Patton preferred it that way. For him, it was a means to an end. Patton wasn't planning reconnaissance at all. He aimed to get his Third Army so committed to battle at the West Wall that Eisenhower would have to agree to their participation. The guns of Patton's Third Army opened up on the morning of January 29, 1945, and began pounding the fortifications. The weather was foul. It began to snow as the assault battalion of the 4th Infantry advanced. They slid across the frozen Our River and blasted their way through Brandscheid with artillery, tank fire, and flamethrowers. Germans fought back, but in ferocious hand-to-hand fighting that ensued, they were pushed back. Although they managed to win back the village of Brandscheid, there had been a partial breakthrough of the West Wall near the town of Prüm. This time, forces attacked them from the rear, the only way of tackling them that offered a real chance of success. The result was a series of blackened, blasted back doors and crews so shocked by the suddenness of the onslaught that many panicked and surrendered. For the next week, they continued destroying pillboxes, 40 of them to each square mile. But the breaching of the West Wall in the Eifel region was only a local success. The fortifications running from Trier on the Moselle down to the Swiss border were still intact. During the assault on the Sauer River, 4th Armoured Division of Patton's Third Army advanced on Bitburg, which they meant to use as a springboard for their own drive to the Rhine. Allied assaults on the West Wall during the previous few days had opened the way for them. They left Bitburg, and 2 days later, on March 7th, the division's lead tanks reached the Rhine. The same morning, the 9th Armoured Division of Hodge's First Army arrived at the Ludendorff railway bridge at Remagen just as German engineers were preparing to blow it up. Germans exploded some of their charges, but the bridge survived long enough for infantry to cross the Rhine and establish the first Allied bridgehead on the other side. 10 days later, the bridge at Remagen collapsed into the river. Although much of the West Wall remained in German hands, it had failed in its prime purpose, to keep the Allies out of Germany. The drive to the Rhine had effectively bypassed the fortifications and made them redundant once again. On March 20th, the 9th Armoured Division made a final assault on the West Wall. They approached warily, expecting the pillboxes to explode with fire. There was none. The pillboxes were empty. Most defenders had gone. Some remained at their posts and surrendered. Others fled under cover of darkness. A few ransacked the ruins of houses for civilian clothes and kept running. Once Allied forces were across the Rhine, it was only a matter of time before the Third Reich collapsed. But the way the West Wall was finally overcome didn't arise from purely military considerations. The Low Countries and northern Germany had come under Montgomery's overall command, so taking this route to invade the Third Reich would have brought forces under British control. However, generals were too chauvinistic to stand for that. This applied particularly to General Patton, whose name for Montgomery was unprintable, and to a lesser extent to General Bradley. To Patton, the idea that his hated rival might be first to reach the Rhine was anathema. As for General Bradley, he had his own secret agenda. In February 1945, when he suggested that Hodges' First Army and Patton's Third Army should mass at the Rhine to cover Montgomery's narrow front thrust across the river, this was important insurance against Germans staging another Ardennes-style offensive. But it was no coincidence that it also made sure the Rhine crossing would be an all-American enterprise. General Patton had made his own contribution to this state of affairs by turning his defensive assignment at the West Wall into aggressive offence. He drew the focus of operations southward. This was the wrong position for a speedy drive to Berlin. Meanwhile, the Russians gained time to move in from the east and reach the German capital first. Subsequently, this enabled them to claim for communism a larger share of Europe than the British and Americans meant them to have. For the next 45 years, until communism collapsed in Europe and the Cold War came to an end, the world had to live with the consequences. While forces bled against concrete and steel in the West, hammering themselves to pieces against Hitler's fortress wall, far to the east, an even more terrible siege was entering its third winter. In a city that had once been the jewel of the Russian Empire, 3 million people faced a horror beyond imagination. They were trapped between German artillery and starvation, between Nazi ideology and Soviet determination. For 872 days, Leningrad would become a laboratory for human endurance, where the line between civilization and savagery dissolved in the frozen darkness of the Russian winter. What happened there would make the West Wall's concrete bunkers seem like a mercy. The second killing field stretched across a frozen wasteland where millions of people faced a choice between starvation and surrender. As German panzers rolled toward Leningrad in September 1941, the city that Peter the Great had built as his window to Europe stood on the brink of annihilation. Army Group North had smashed through the Baltic states with terrifying speed, cutting the rail link to Moscow and trapping massive Soviet forces in their path. The Wehrmacht's 18th Army prepared for what everyone expected would be the final assault, a direct attack on the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution. But Hitler had other plans. The Führer's decision would create one of history's most horrific sieges, a deliberate campaign of starvation that would last 872 days. Unlike the tactical necessity that drove other battles, this represented Nazi ideology in its purest form, a systematic attempt to eliminate an entire population through hunger and cold. Hitler's directive was clear. Leningrad would not be stormed, occupied, or administered. It would simply be starved out of existence. The decision haunted German commanders who understood its military implications. Colonel General Franz Halder, Army Chief of Staff, privately questioned the wisdom of bypassing such a strategic prize. Field Marshal Wilhelm von Lieb, commanding Army Group North, had already drawn up assault plans for the city. His forces were positioned, his artillery was ranged, and his troops were ready. Then came the order from the Führer's headquarters: no direct assault. Several factors influenced Hitler's choice. The massive explosions that had devastated German troops in Kiev still echoed in his mind. Soviet engineers had turned their own abandoned city into a death trap with remote-controlled bombs. The thought of Wehrmacht soldiers fighting house to house through Leningrad's industrial districts, facing similar booby traps and urban warfare, concerned him deeply. Better to let hunger accomplish what bullets might fail to achieve. There was also the cold calculation of resources. The massive siege guns needed to reduce Leningrad's defences had already been allocated to Army Group South for the coming battles in the Crimea. Moving them across the vast expanse of Russia would delay operations into winter. Fourth, Panzer Group was being withdrawn from Army Group North in late September to support the final drive on Moscow. Without tanks or heavy artillery, a direct assault would be prohibitively costly. So, starvation became policy. The city would be sealed off, its population left to weaken while German forces turned their attention to more pressing objectives. It was a decision that would define not just the siege, but the character of the entire war in the East. General Georgy Zhukov arrived in Leningrad in early September 1941 to find a city approaching crisis. The previous commander had been relieved after German troops penetrated the outer ring of defences and begun advancing through the suburbs. Civilians were fleeing the city in growing numbers, carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Military coordination was breaking down. The political apparatus struggled to maintain control. Zhukov wasted no time implementing drastic measures. The man Stalin called, when situations turned desperate, immediately set about transforming chaos into organized resistance. Anti-tank guns were in short supply, so anti-aircraft artillery was converted to ground targets. The same weapons that protected the city from the Luftwaffe would now try to halt German panzers. Naval infantry brigades were hastily formed from available personnel. Students were organized into combat units. Reinforcements were brought in from wherever they could be found. The shortage of everything forced innovation, born of desperation. Factory workers melted down scrap metal to create anti-tank obstacles. Civilians dug trenches and tank traps throughout the city. Women formed fire brigades to combat the incendiary bombs that rained down nightly. When regular ammunition ran low, improvised explosive devices were crafted from whatever chemicals the city's laboratories could provide. Zhukov's most crucial decision was psychological rather than tactical. Instead of the purely defensive posture that had characterized the campaign so far, he ordered raids and counterattacks against German positions. These weren't designed to break the siege. That was impossible with available forces. They were meant to convince both defenders and attackers that Leningrad would fight to the end. The German 18th Army had fought its way to within artillery range of the city centre. Their forward positions could observe the golden spires of the Admiralty and the Winter Palace. Shells began falling on Nevsky Prospect, the city's main thoroughfare. The siege guns that Hitler had refused to commit to a direct assault were more than adequate for terrorizing the civilian population. Then, just as victory seemed within grasp, 4th Panzer Group was pulled out for the Moscow offensive. The departure of virtually all German armour left Army Group North essentially immobile. What had been planned as a brief siege before final assault became an indefinite containment operation. The ring around Leningrad was never completely closed, a fact that would prove crucial to the city's survival. Two significant gaps remained in the German encirclement. To the north, Finnish forces under Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim had advanced to the old 1939 border, but refused to move beyond it. Mannerheim was fighting to recover territory lost in the Winter War, not to participate in Nazi extermination campaigns. This Finnish restraint left narrow corridors through the virgin forests that Soviet forces could exploit, though the supplies that got through were minimal. The second gap lay across the waters of Lake Ladoga. Europe's largest lake stretched northeast of the city, and while German forces controlled much of its shoreline, they couldn't seal off access entirely. As autumn gave way to winter, this body of water would become Leningrad's lifeline, literally the road between survival and extinction. October brought the first clear signs of the horror to come. The German advance had severed all rail connections to the city. Food supplies that had seemed adequate for a brief siege began to dwindle alarmingly when measured against an indefinite blockade. Rationing was introduced, then tightened repeatedly as the situation deteriorated. By November, manual workers were receiving bread rations that had fallen to levels far below subsistence needs. Office workers and children received even less. The bread itself was barely recognizable as such. What little wheat flour remained was mixed with sawdust, cellulose, and whatever organic matter could be found. The dark, bitter loaves that emerged from bakeries contained more wood pulp than grain. Still, these miserable rations represented survival for another day, and people queued for hours in the bitter cold to receive them. November brought the first snow, and with it the transformation of Lake Ladoga into the road of life. When the lake froze, solid enough to support vehicle traffic, Soviet engineers marked a route across its southwestern corner. Convoys of supply trucks began their hazardous journey from the railhead at Tikhvin to the besieged city. It was a passage through hell. Biting northeastern gales swept across the open ice. German aircraft strafed the convoys, and artillery fire tried to break the ice surface beneath them. The lake claimed hundreds of trucks and thousands of tons of supplies. Drivers who survived described the journey as a form of Russian roulette played with frost, enemy fire, and the constant threat of plunging through the ice into the black waters below. Vehicles that broke through disappeared completely, taking their crews and precious cargo to the bottom of Europe's largest lake. Yet, for all its horror, the road of life was exactly that, the only thing standing between Leningrad's population and total starvation. Even with the lake route functioning, the supplies getting through were pitifully inadequate. The city needed thousands of tons of food daily to sustain its population. The convoys could deliver hundreds at best. The mathematics of starvation were inexorable, and by late November, the first deaths from hunger began appearing in the city's hospitals. December brought horrors that tested the limits of human endurance. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing and kept falling, reaching the kinds of extremes that turned the Russian winter into a weapon of war. The city's power grid collapsed under German bombardment and fuel shortages. Water pipes froze and burst, leaving entire districts without sanitation. Medical supplies dwindled to almost nothing, making disease as deadly as starvation. The social fabric began to fray under the pressure. Families turned against each other over scraps of food. Children learned to hide whatever small portions they received. Parents made impossible choices about which family members would receive what little nutrition was available. The elderly and very young died first, their bodies unable to generate enough heat to survive the dual assault of cold and hunger. In the factories that remained operational, workers collapsed at their machines. Those who fell were often too weak to get back up. Production lines ground to a halt as skilled technicians succumbed to starvation and exhaustion. The city that had been one of the Soviet Union's greatest industrial centers was slowly grinding to a halt. The winter of 1941 to 42 witnessed the breakdown of normal civilization. Soviet authorities began receiving reports of cannibalism in the city, though the exact scale remains disputed by historians. Since the criminal code made no mention of such offences, authorities classified these cases as extreme forms of banditry. According to official reports, investigations led to criminal charges against individuals each month, with the numbers rising through the winter. The horror had touched every demographic in the city. Police reports documented disturbing incidents, including intrusions into cemeteries and desecration of graves. The increase in such activities forced city authorities to post guards at major cemeteries. These were the kinds of measures that would have been unthinkable before the siege, but had become necessary as the boundary between civilization and survival dissolved entirely. Yet for all the horror, resistance continued in remarkable ways. The city's radio stations never went silent, broadcasting defiant messages to both the population and the outside world. Cultural life persisted even under the most extreme conditions. Dmitri Shostakovich composed his Seventh Symphony in the besieged city, with its famous depiction of the German advance as a mindless, mechanical crescendo. When the Leningrad Philharmonic performed the work in August 1942, many of the musicians were weakened by hunger, but they played nonetheless. The performance became a symbol of the city's refusal to surrender its humanity, even under the most inhuman conditions. The concert was broadcast to the world, demonstrating that Leningrad remained unbroken despite everything the Nazis had thrown at it. It was a powerful propaganda victory that resonated far beyond the city's borders. The German forces surrounding the city faced their own ordeal during that terrible winter. Most German soldiers had only summer uniforms, as the High Command had confidently predicted the campaign would be over before winter. Frostbite casualties mounted alarmingly, as temperatures dropped to levels most Germans had never experienced. Weapons froze and became inoperable. Vehicle engines seized up in the cold. What was supposed to be a simple containment operation became a struggle for survival. The tactical situation around Leningrad became a microcosm of the broader German dilemma on the Eastern Front. Army Group North was stuck in place, unable to advance or withdraw, consuming resources without achieving objectives. The siege that was supposed to cost nothing was actually draining men and material at an alarming rate. Partisan attacks in the rear areas disrupted supply lines. The few roads available for logistics became nearly impassable in the winter conditions. Soviet counterattacks, while never strong enough to break the siege, kept German forces constantly on edge. Small-scale raids and infiltration attempts meant there was no safe rear area. German commanders found themselves fighting a static war of attrition, exactly the kind of grinding contest that favoured the Red Army's superior numbers and willingness to accept casualties. The spring of 1942 brought a brief respite, as improved weather made the road of life more reliable. More supplies began reaching the city, and the daily death toll from starvation began to decline from its winter peaks. But the siege was far from over. German forces had used the winter to strengthen their positions, laying extensive minefields and constructing elaborate bunker systems. Any attempt to break out would be tremendously costly. Throughout 1943, the siege continued with grinding predictability. Soviet forces launched periodic offensives to try to establish a land corridor to the city, but these efforts repeatedly failed against determined German resistance. The human cost was staggering on both sides. Soviet divisions were committed to the Leningrad front and emerged badly mauled. German units that had entered Russia as elite formations were reduced to skeleton crews of exhausted veterans. The psychological impact of the siege extended far beyond its immediate participants. In Moscow, Stalin grew increasingly frustrated with the failure to relieve Leningrad. The city had enormous symbolic value as the birthplace of the revolution and the site of Lenin's rise to power. Allowing it to fall to Nazi starvation tactics would be both a military disaster and an ideological catastrophe. Resources that might have been used elsewhere were poured into repeated failed attempts to break the blockade. For the Germans, the siege became an albatross around the neck of their entire eastern strategy. Army Group North's divisions were tied down in static positions, while the decisive battles of the war were fought elsewhere. The troops besieging Leningrad could have made a crucial difference at Stalingrad or Kursk. Instead, they remained frozen in place, accomplishing nothing while consuming precious resources. The international implications were equally significant. The siege became a powerful symbol of Nazi brutality that helped solidify the Allied coalition. Reports of the systematic starvation of civilians reached the West, reinforcing arguments that this was a war between civilization and barbarism. The siege helped convince neutral nations that Nazi Germany represented an existential threat to humanity itself. The beginning of the end came in January 1944. After 2.5 years of failed attempts, Soviet forces finally managed to coordinate a successful offensive that broke through German lines south of the city. The Leningrad-Novgorod strategic offensive threw massive Soviet forces against the weakened German positions. Army Group North, depleted by years of attrition and transfers to other fronts, simply lacked the strength to hold such an extended line. The offensive had been carefully planned to exploit German weaknesses that had developed over the long siege. Soviet commanders had learned from previous failures, concentrating their forces at carefully selected breakthrough points, rather than spreading them along the entire front. Artillery bombardments were more intense and better coordinated than in earlier attempts. Air support was available in quantities that would have been unimaginable in 1941. On January 14, 1944, the first supply trains in over 2 years began reaching the city via newly liberated territory. Regular railway service brought not just food and medicine, but proof that the nightmare was finally ending. The psychological impact was as important as the material relief. People could finally believe that they had survived the siege. The siege was officially declared over on January 27th, though German artillery continued to shell outlying areas for several more weeks. Artillery fire had become so much a part of daily life that its absence seemed strange to many residents. The city that had endured 872 days of siege was finally free. The human cost defied comprehension. Estimates of civilian deaths vary, but conservative figures place the toll at over 1 million people, making it one of the deadliest sieges in human history. The actual figure may have been much higher, as accurate record-keeping became impossible during the worst periods. Entire families simply disappeared, leaving no trace except empty apartments that were eventually assigned to new residents. The children who survived emerged traumatized by experiences that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. For the German Army Group North, the lifting of the Leningrad siege marked the beginning of a long retreat toward the Reich. The panzer divisions that had once seemed unstoppable were now reduced to hollow shells of their former strength. The infantry units that had conquered half of Europe were decimated by years of Russian winters and Soviet counterattacks. As the Red Army pressed its advantage, Army Group North fell back through the Baltic states, leaving behind the graves of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had died for Hitler's vision of racial empire. The siege's strategic consequences rippled throughout the war. Hitler's decision to starve rather than storm, Leningrad had tied down massive German forces for nearly 3 years while accomplishing nothing of military value. The resources expended on maintaining the blockade could have changed the outcome of battles from Stalingrad to Normandy. Instead, Army Group North became a strategic dead end, consuming men and material while contributing nothing to Germany's increasingly desperate situation. More importantly, the siege demonstrated the ultimate bankruptcy of Nazi ideology when applied to military strategy. Hitler's racial fantasies had overruled military logic, turning what should have been a swift conquest into a prolonged attrition battle that Germany could not win. The decision to starve Leningrad revealed the Third Reich's fundamental weakness, its inability to separate ideological goals from military necessities. In trying to eliminate the city's population, the Nazis had instead created a symbol of resistance that would inspire the Soviet war effort and haunt the German conscience for generations. The survivors of Leningrad carried their experience like a wound that never healed. They had witnessed the collapse of normal life and the triumph of human endurance over seemingly impossible odds. Their city had refused to die, even when death seemed the only rational response to such suffering. In doing so, they had written one of the most heroic and horrific chapters in the history of warfare. The siege became a testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. As Leningrad endured its frozen hell, halfway around the world, a jungle island would become the grave of empires. Where the Russian siege had been about survival against starvation, this new battlefield would be about expansion versus containment. Japan's rising sun had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum, conquering territories from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines. But on one obscure island that most Americans had never heard of, that momentum would finally meet its match. The battle for Guadalcanal would prove that even the most fanatical determination could be broken by superior resources and unshakable resolve. It would be the first time in the war that Japanese forces would taste the bitter fruit of total defeat. The third killing field lay in the steaming jungles of the Solomon Islands, where Japan's conquering tide would finally break against American steel. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched over a vast area of the Western Pacific like a malignant growth. After Pearl Harbor's devastating surprise, Japanese forces had moved with lightning speed to capture Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, Borneo, the Philippines, and Singapore. By spring, Japanese troops were in New Guinea, and the Rising Sun flag flew over territories spanning from the Aleutian Islands to the edge of Australia. But expansion breeds its own problems. Each conquest required garrisons, each garrison demanded supplies, and each supply line stretched Japanese resources thinner. By May 1942, cracks were already showing in the empire's facade of invincibility. The Battle of the Coral Sea had forced Japan to abandon plans for attacking Port Moresby in New Guinea. More ominously, the stunning American victory at Midway in early June had persuaded Japanese leadership to halt their expansion into the Pacific. Consolidation was now the order of the day. But Japanese strategic planners understood that static defense was ultimately a losing proposition against America's growing industrial might. They needed forward bases that could threaten Allied supply lines while protecting their own conquests. In late June, Allied intelligence in the Solomon Islands reported a worrying development. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were constructing an airfield. the island itself seemed unremarkable to most observers. Guadalcanal stretched roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered in dense jungle and bisected by mountains that rose to 8,000 feet. The climate was tropical hell. Temperatures routinely exceeded 90 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity levels that made breathing feel like drowning. Malaria-carrying mosquitoes swarmed in clouds thick enough to darken the sky. Venomous snakes, crocodiles, and dangerous insects completed the natural hazards. But geography made Guadalcanal strategically vital. An operational Japanese airfield there would threaten the precious supply line between Hawaii and Australia. American and Australian forces fighting in New Guinea would be cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The entire Allied position in the South Pacific could collapse like a house of cards. In Washington, the American chiefs of staff considered their response. Initial plans called for a simple raid to destroy the airfield under construction. But as planners studied the situation, a far more ambitious scheme emerged. Instead of merely raiding Guadalcanal, American forces would capture the island and establish their own airbase. It would be the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific, codenamed Operation Watchtower. The plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. American planners knew virtually nothing about Guadalcanal's terrain, climate, or defenses. Maps were scarce and unreliable. Air reconnaissance was limited. The Marine units, tasked with the assault, had arrived in New Zealand expecting no combat duties until 1943. Now, they had weeks to prepare for a major amphibious operation. Major General Alexander Vandergrift commanded the 1st Marine Division, a force built around veteran units, but containing thousands of recruits who had never seen combat. When Vandergrift received his orders at Wellington on June 25th, his division was still arriving and organizing in New Zealand. Disease was affecting his troops. Labor difficulties in Wellington were slowing the unloading of essential supplies. The rehearsal exercises in Fiji revealed coordination problems between landing craft and their supporting units. Vandergrift requested a postponement from the August 1st assault date. He received exactly 6 days. The operation would proceed on August 7th, regardless of preparation levels. The Marines would have to learn their trade on the job. The Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal was smaller than American intelligence estimated, but better prepared than expected. Rear Admiral Sadayoshi Yamada commanded several thousand troops, including construction workers racing to complete the airfield and military personnel defending the site. While many were engineers and laborers, the force included combat veterans of the China campaigns who understood jungle warfare. More importantly, the island lay within range of Japanese air and naval forces based at Rabaul on New Britain. Vice Admiral Robert Gormley commanded the overall watchtower operation from his headquarters in Auckland. The 57-year-old admiral had served as a liaison officer in London and brought organizational skills to the task of coordinating a complex amphibious assault. His subordinate, Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, would command the naval task force that included aircraft carriers Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp. Fletcher had fought at the Coral Sea and Midway, giving him extensive carrier combat experience. The landing force would be transported by Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious fleet. Turner was a staff officer turned amphibious warfare specialist who had developed theories about beach assault. His concepts would face their first real test on Guadalcanal's shores. At dawn, on August 7th, 1942, a substantial Allied fleet appeared off Guadalcanal's northern coast. 82 ships carried approximately 19,000 Marines, toward what everyone expected would be a brutal fight for the airfield. Instead, the landing proved almost anticlimactic. Japanese construction workers had fled into the jungle at the first sight of American ships. The combat troops present offered scattered resistance before withdrawing inland. By evening on August 8th, Marines had secured the nearly completed airfield and renamed it Henderson Field in honor of a Midway hero. Casualties were light, supplies were flowing ashore, and the operation appeared to be succeeding beyond expectations. That illusion shattered before dawn on August 9th. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa had been monitoring Allied radio traffic from his headquarters at Rabaul. The moment American ships appeared off Guadalcanal, he began assembling a strike force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer. While American forces celebrated their easy victory, Mikawa's ships were already racing down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands that led directly to Guadalcanal. Admiral Fletcher had positioned his carrier task force south of Guadalcanal to provide air cover for the landing. But Fletcher was concerned about fuel consumption and aircraft losses from the previous day's operations. In the afternoon of August 8th, he made a controversial decision that would affect the entire campaign. He withdrew his carriers from the area. Fletcher cited fuel concerns and the need to avoid Japanese submarine attacks, but his departure left the Marines without air cover and the transport ships without protection. Admiral Turner positioned his cruiser screen north and south of Savo Island to protect the transport anchorage. Destroyers took advanced positions to provide early warning of Japanese approach. It was a defensive formation that should have been adequate against conventional threats. Mikawa had no intention of fighting conventionally. Shortly after midnight on August 9th, Japanese cruisers swept past the Allied picket ships in single file. Lookouts on the destroyers spotted unidentified vessels, but communication failures prevented immediate warning to the main fleet. Mikawa's ships had achieved complete tactical surprise. At approximately 1:43 a.m., Japanese cruisers launched their first salvos against Allied forces. Searchlights stabbed through the darkness, illuminating Allied ships like actors on a stage. The heavy cruiser Astoria took multiple hits before her crew could react effectively. Quincy absorbed a devastating barrage that killed most of her bridge crew. Vincennes exploded in flames that could be seen for miles. Mikawa's force then turned south to engage the remaining Allied cruisers. The Australian heavy cruiser Canberra was hit so heavily that she had to be scuttled the following morning. Chicago took torpedo damage that left her barely able to maintain formation. In less than an hour, the Imperial Japanese Navy had sunk 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged others while suffering only minor damage in return. The Battle of Savo Island was a devastating defeat for Allied naval forces. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died in the dark waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. The seafloor became so littered with sunken warships that Marines dubbed it Iron Bottom Sound. More importantly, for the immediate situation, Admiral Turner had lost a significant portion of his defensive capability while Mikawa's force remained intact and dangerous. Turner made the only decision available to him: immediate evacuation of the transport fleet. By evening, on August 9th, every American ship had left Guadalcanal's waters. The Marines were left with whatever supplies had already been unloaded, which amounted to roughly half of what they needed for sustained operations. They had no air cover, no naval support, and no guarantee that either would return. General Vandergrift found himself commanding an isolated force on a hostile island with minimal supplies and no clear plan for reinforcement or evacuation. The situation looked desperate, but Vandegrift was a professional Marine who had spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of challenge. If his men were going to survive, Henderson Field had to become operational immediately. Japanese reaction to the American landing was swift but divided. Army and Navy commanders disagreed about whether Guadalcanal represented a serious threat or a minor irritation. The Navy wanted immediate reinforcement to retake the island. The Army preferred to let the Americans weaken while continuing operations in New Guinea. This strategic confusion would plague Japanese efforts throughout the campaign. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake commanded the Japanese 17th Army, which included all ground forces in the Solomon Islands. Hyakutake initially underestimated the American landing as a reconnaissance that could be easily repelled. Rather than committing major resources to Guadalcanal, he authorized only a relatively small detachment under Colonel Kiyono Ichiki to investigate the situation. Ichiki commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment, elite troops who had fought in China and participated in the capture of Guam. The approximately 900 men under his command were veterans of jungle warfare who believed absolutely in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over American materialism. Ichiki himself embodied the samurai ethos that had driven Japanese expansion across the Pacific. He was convinced that a determined night attack would sweep the Americans into the sea. On August 18th, Ichiki's force landed at Taivu Point, 22 miles east of Henderson Field. American coast watchers, Allied intelligence operatives who had remained hidden throughout the Japanese conquest, reported the landing immediately. Vandegrift knew an attack was coming and began preparing his defences accordingly. Henderson Field had become operational on August 20th when the first Marine aircraft landed on its hastily completed runway. Marine fighters and dive bombers gave the Americans their first tactical air support since the carrier withdrawal. More importantly, the presence of American aircraft meant that Japanese ships could no longer operate safely in daylight hours around Guadalcanal. The strategic balance was already shifting in favor of the defenders. Ichiki spent 2 days reconnoitering American positions before launching his attack. He identified what appeared to be a weak point in the marine perimeter near the mouth of Alligator Creek, which Americans had mistakenly named the Tenaroo River. The position was held by companies from the 1st Marine Regiment, troops who had spent months training in amphibious warfare. What Ichiki saw as weakness was actually a carefully prepared killing ground. At approximately 3 a.m. on August 21st, Ichiki's troops launched their assault across the sandbar at the mouth of Alligator Creek. The attack followed classic Japanese doctrine, a massed bayonet charge designed to achieve moral ascendancy over the enemy through sheer audacity. Japanese soldiers screamed battle cries as they charged across open ground toward prepared American positions. It was a magnificent display of courage that proved tactically suicidal. Marine machine gunners had pre-registered their fire on the sandbar crossing. Mortar crews had calculated ranges to every likely approach route. Artillery observers could bring down concentrated fire within minutes. When Ichiki's men emerged from the jungle, they ran into a wall of coordinated firepower that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome. The slaughter was methodical and complete. Marines cut down attacking Japanese in waves, their bodies piling up on the sandbar like driftwood after a storm. Those who survived the initial assault found themselves trapped between American positions and the creek behind them. Ichiki ordered repeated attacks throughout the night, each one ending in more Japanese casualties. By dawn, most of Ichiki's force was dead or dying. American casualties numbered fewer than 50. Japanese losses exceeded 800 men, virtually the entire attacking force. Colonel Ichiki survived the battle, but was killed later in the campaign. The circumstances of his eventual death remain disputed by historians. The Battle of the Tenaru River demonstrated that Japanese tactical doctrine was inadequate against well-prepared American positions. Banzai charges might succeed against poorly equipped forces or surprise defenders, but they were useless against Marines who had time to prepare and coordinate their firepower. More importantly, the battle proved that American forces could defeat elite Japanese troops in open combat. The myth of Japanese invincibility suffered its first serious crack. Japanese high command reacted to the Tenaru disaster with confusion and disbelief. How could elite Imperial Army troops be defeated by American Marines? Initial reports blamed poor intelligence and inadequate preparation. The solution seemed obvious: send more troops with better planning and coordination. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi received orders to retake Henderson Field with his 35th Infantry Brigade. Kawaguchi was a more sophisticated commander than Ichiki. He understood that frontal assaults against prepared positions were futile. Instead, he planned a coordinated attack from multiple directions that would split American defenses and prevent mutual support. His main force would approach Henderson Field from the south through difficult jungle terrain. Secondary attacks from the east and west would pin down American reserves. The plan looked promising on paper, but ignored crucial practical considerations. Guadalcanal's jungle was far more difficult to traverse than Japanese planners realized. What appeared to be solid ground on aerial photographs turned out to be swamps that could swallow entire companies. Dense vegetation blocked radio communications between widely separated forces. Tropical diseases weakened units before they ever reached American positions. Meanwhile, American reinforcements were arriving despite Japanese efforts to prevent them. The Tokyo Express, fast cruiser and destroyer, runs that brought Japanese troops and supplies under cover of darkness, was matched by American convoys that risked daylight passages to deliver Marines and equipment. Both sides were feeding reinforcements into Guadalcanal, like gamblers doubling down on a losing hand. The island was becoming a meat grinder that consumed entire units. Henderson Field's aircraft played an increasingly important role in the campaign. Marine pilots flying from the primitive airstrip could intercept Japanese bombers before they reached their targets. Dive bombers could attack Japanese shipping during daylight hours, forcing enemy supply runs into the dangerous nighttime window. Fighter aircraft provided close support for ground troops, a capability that Japanese forces lacked after losing their own airfields. Colonel Merritt Edson commanded the Marine Raider Battalion that had been tasked with defending the southern approaches to Henderson Field. Red Mike Edson was a professional warrior who had spent years studying Japanese tactics and psychology. When intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese build-up south of the airfield, Edson positioned his raiders on a low ridge that dominated the most likely approach routes. The position would soon earn the name that defined the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Kawaguchi's offensive began on the night of September 12th, with coordinated attacks against multiple points in the American perimeter. The main effort came exactly where Edson expected, up the ridge that protected Henderson Field's southern flank. For 2 days and nights, Japanese forces threw themselves against Marine positions in attacks that combined tactical sophistication with determined assault. The fighting on what became known as Bloody Ridge tested both sides to their limits. Outnumbered raiders held their positions through professional competence and mutual support. When Japanese forces broke through at one point, Marine reserves counterattacked with bayonets and rifle butts. Artillery support from Henderson Field's perimeter guns broke up massed Japanese assaults before they could achieve their objectives. By dawn on September 15th, Kawaguchi's offensive had failed with heavy losses. The defeat at Bloody Ridge marked the beginning of the end for Japanese hopes of retaking Guadalcanal. Two major ground offensives had failed with significant casualties. Japanese naval forces controlled the waters around Guadalcanal during nighttime hours, but American aircraft dominated during the day. The strategic situation was becoming a stalemate that favored American industrial capacity over Japanese fighting spirit. October brought one final Japanese effort to reverse the situation on Guadalcanal. General Hyakutake himself arrived on the island with additional reinforcements that brought Japanese strength to substantial levels. The plan called for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions while Japanese naval forces eliminated Henderson Field through bombardment. It was the most ambitious Japanese operation since the initial conquest of the Philippines. The land offensive began on October 23rd, with attacks along portions of the American perimeter. Japanese forces had learned from previous failures, using artillery and mortars to suppress American positions before infantry assaults. Coordination between units showed improvement through better planning. For the first time in the campaign, Japanese attacks achieved local successes that threatened American positions. But Henderson Field remained operational despite repeated bombardments. Marine aircraft continued to launch from the battered airstrip even while shells were falling around them. American reinforcements arrived faster than Japanese planners had expected. Most importantly, Japanese forces were running low on ammunition and supplies due to American interdiction of their supply lines. The October offensive collapsed after 10 days of fighting that cost both sides thousands of casualties. Japanese forces withdrew into the jungle to await further reinforcements that would never come. American positions around Henderson Field were secure, but the Marines were exhausted after months of constant combat. The campaign had become a contest of endurance that neither side could sustain indefinitely. In Tokyo, Emperor Hirohito's military advisors faced an unpleasant reality. 3 major offensives had failed to retake Guadalcanal, despite committing substantial forces and accepting heavy casualties. The island was consuming resources that were desperately needed elsewhere as American forces prepared new offensives across the Pacific. Continuing the Guadalcanal campaign meant sacrificing other strategic positions to hold one jungle airfield. The decision to evacuate Guadalcanal was made in late December 1942, but not implemented until the following February. Japanese planners needed time to develop a withdrawal plan that would preserve as many troops as possible while maintaining secrecy. The evacuation was disguised as a reinforcement operation to prevent American interference. Fast destroyers would remove troops during nighttime runs that appeared to be supply missions. Operation K, the Japanese evacuation of Guadalcanal, began on January 14, 1943. Over several nights, Japanese destroyers removed approximately 10,600 troops from positions around Henderson Field. American intelligence failed to recognize the true nature of these missions until it was too late to interfere effectively. The evacuation was a tactical success that saved thousands of Japanese lives while concealing the magnitude of the strategic defeat. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese positions around Henderson Field were empty. After 6 months of brutal fighting, Guadalcanal belonged entirely to Allied forces. The first major Japanese defeat of the Pacific War was complete. The human cost of the Guadalcanal campaign was staggering. American casualties totaled approximately 7,100 dead and nearly 8,000 wounded. Japanese losses exceeded 25,000 dead, with additional thousands evacuated in various states of injury and disease. Both navies lost dozens of warships in the waters around the island. Hundreds of aircraft were destroyed or damaged beyond repair. But the strategic consequences far exceeded the immediate casualties. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had been forced to abandon territory they had conquered. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken permanently. More importantly, Guadalcanal proved that American industrial capacity could sustain prolonged operations in the Pacific, while Japanese resources were finite and increasingly strained. The campaign also demonstrated the crucial importance of air power in Pacific warfare. Henderson Field's aircraft had tipped the balance by interdicting Japanese supply lines while protecting American reinforcements. Future Pacific operations would be planned around securing airfields rather than traditional military objectives. The lesson was clear: whoever controlled the air would control the Pacific. For the United States, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of an offensive strategy that would carry American forces across the Pacific to Japan itself. The techniques developed during the campaign, amphibious assault, close air support, jungle warfare, would be refined and perfected in subsequent operations. More importantly, American forces had gained confidence in their ability to defeat Japanese troops in sustained combat. The psychological transformation was as important as any tactical innovation. Japan's first defeat at Guadalcanal set the stage for their final, most desperate stand. The rising sun that had once seemed destined to rule the Pacific was now setting behind a wall of American steel and determination. As Allied forces island-hopped their way across the Central Pacific, each victory brought them closer to the ultimate prize, Japan itself. But the empire would not go quietly into defeat. On one final island, 80 miles from the sacred homeland, Japanese forces would make their last stand with weapons that defied every convention of warfare. Okinawa would witness the birth of the kamikaze age, where death itself became a weapon and suicide became strategy. It would be a preview of the hell that awaited anyone who dared invade Japan proper. By spring 1945, Japan's Pacific Empire lay in ruins, but one final battle would determine whether the rising sun would set in nuclear fire or conventional blood. Okinawa stretched like a dagger pointed at Japan's heart, just 350 miles from the sacred home islands. This 60-mile-long island represented more than strategic geography. It was the last major stepping stone before invasion of Japan itself. Both sides understood that Okinawa would be a preview of the apocalyptic struggle awaiting on Japan's shores. The Japanese prepared to fight with a fanaticism that would shock even veteran American forces. The Americans assembled one of the largest amphibious forces in Pacific War history. Admiral Chester Nimitz had originally planned to invade Formosa, but the massive scale of that operation exceeded available resources. Okinawa offered similar strategic advantages, with more manageable logistics. From Okinawan airfields, American bombers could reach every corner of the Japanese home islands. The island's ports could support the eventual invasion of Japan. Operation Iceberg would be the capstone of America's Pacific campaign. The forces assembled for Okinawa represented the peak of American military power. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner's 10th Army included approximately 183,000 ground combat troops supported by massive logistical operations. Additional service and support personnel would bring total American participation to well over 200,000. The naval component included substantial numbers of combat vessels and hundreds of auxiliary ships. By campaign's end, this would be one of the largest military operations in Pacific War history. The naval forces included task forces that represented the pinnacle of American industrial might. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher commanded Task Force 58 with its fast carrier groups, the most powerful naval strike force ever assembled. Multiple battleships provided gunfire support that could level entire mountains. Dozens of destroyers formed protective screens around the invasion fleet. For the first time in the Pacific, British carriers joined American forces as Task Force 57 under Vice Admiral Bernard Rawlings. But numbers alone would not determine Okinawa's outcome. 1-0. The island's Japanese defenders had spent months preparing defenses that would make previous Pacific battles seem like skirmishes. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded the 32nd Army, approximately 65,000 regular troops, supplemented by thousands of Okinawan militia and support personnel. More importantly, Ushijima had abandoned traditional Japanese tactics in favor of a defense-in-depth strategy designed to bleed American forces white. Ushijima's chief of staff, Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, had studied American amphibious operations throughout the Pacific. Yahara understood that banzai charges against American firepower were suicidal gestures that accomplished nothing. Instead, the 32nd Army would fight a prolonged battle of attrition from prepared positions. Every cave would become a fortress. Every ridge would be defended to the last man. The Americans would pay in blood for every yard of Okinawan soil. The island's geography favored the defenders. Southern Okinawa was a nightmare of limestone ridges, honeycombed with natural caves and burial tombs. Ushijima's troops converted these formations into mutually supporting strongpoints connected by tunnels and underground passages. Artillery pieces were positioned in reverse slopes where they couldn't be spotted by naval observation. Machine gun nests were carved into solid rock with overlapping fields of fire. The Japanese defense plan represented a fundamental shift in imperial strategy. Previous Pacific battles had been fought to preserve Japanese territory and forces. Okinawa would be different. Every Japanese soldier was expendable if his death delayed the American advance. The goal wasn't victory, but time. Time for Japan to prepare its home defenses. Time for suicide weapons to devastate the invasion fleet. Time for America to lose its stomach for the slaughter that invading Japan would require. The first phase of that strategy began before American troops ever set foot on Okinawan beaches. Imperial General Headquarters had concentrated over 1,500 aircraft on Formosa, Kyushu, and around Tokyo, specifically for the Okinawa battle. Most of these planes would be flown by suicide pilots in mass attacks called kikusui, floating chrysanthemum operations. The kamikaze had evolved from desperate improvisation to systematic tactical doctrine. Japanese aircraft designers had created specialized suicide weapons that represented the ultimate marriage of technology and fanaticism. The Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, Cherry Blossom, was a rocket-powered flying bomb carried beneath a Betty bomber. When released near its target, the Oka would glide at nearly 300 miles per hour before igniting rockets that accelerated it to over 400 miles per hour in its final dive. The 800-kilogram warhead could sink a destroyer or cripple a battleship. American pilots dubbed the weapon Baka, Japanese for fool, but there was nothing foolish about its destructive potential. Even more ominous were the naval suicide weapons being deployed around Okinawa. The Kaiten, Divine Fate, was essentially a manned torpedo that could deliver devastating attacks against anchored vessels. Based on the highly effective long-lance torpedo, the Kaiten carried a 1,500-pound warhead at 40 knots. Its pilot sat in a tiny cockpit equipped with a periscope, steering his weapon toward enemy ships with the precision of human guidance. Complementing these were substantial numbers of shinyo, ocean shakers, suicide motorboats hidden in caves around Okinawa's coastline. These 18-foot plywood craft were powered by automobile engines and carried depth charges or bow-mounted explosive devices. The plan called for swarms of shinyo to attack American shipping in coordinated night assaults. Most would be destroyed before reaching their targets, but even a few successes could cripple invasion logistics. The ultimate expression of Japanese desperation was the final voyage of the battleship Yamato. At 69,000 tons, Yamato was the largest battleship ever built, mounting 9 18-inch guns that could engage targets at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Her armor was designed to withstand hits from the most powerful Allied weapons. In theory, she represented the pinnacle of naval engineering. In practice, she had become an expensive symbol of Japan's inability to project power beyond its shrinking perimeter. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commanding the combined fleet, ordered Yamato on Operation Tengo, a desperate mission to Okinawa. The great battleship would attack the American invasion fleet and, if that failed, beach herself on the island's shores to use her massive guns as coastal artillery. It was a mission that combined military desperation with symbolic suicide. Yamato sailed with limited fuel, enough for the mission but insufficient for a safe return to port. On April 6th, Yamato sortied from the inland sea, accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. American submarine patrols detected the force immediately and shadowed it through the night. By dawn on April 7th, Admiral Mitcher's carrier aircraft were already launching from Task Force 58. The largest battleship in the world would face the most powerful carrier strike force in history. The attack began at 12:30 p.m. with coordinated strikes by over 300 American aircraft. Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses were formidable, but she was designed to fight other battleships, not swarms of dive bombers and torpedo planes. The first torpedo hits flooded her port compartments, creating a list that made effective gunnery impossible. Subsequent bomb hits destroyed her communications and fire control systems. By 2:20 p.m., secondary explosions were tearing the great ship apart. Yamato capsized and exploded in a fireball that could be seen from over 100 miles away. Nearly 3,000 Japanese sailors died with their ship, including Admiral Seiichi Ito, who went down with his flagship. The sacrifice accomplished nothing except to demonstrate Japan's commitment to fighting until total annihilation. American losses in the attack totaled 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew. The age of the battleship was officially over. Meanwhile, on Okinawa itself, one of the largest amphibious assaults in Pacific War history was beginning with surprising ease. At dawn on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, American landing craft approached the Higuchi beaches on Okinawa's western coast. Preparatory bombardment had been among the heaviest in Pacific War history, with battleships and cruisers firing thousands of rounds in the final week. Carrier aircraft had flown thousands of sorties against suspected Japanese positions. The beaches should have been moonscapes of shattered coral and twisted metal. Instead, American troops encountered virtually no resistance. The first waves splashed ashore, expecting to fight for every foothold on the beach. They found empty bunkers and abandoned positions. By evening, 60,000 troops were ashore, with casualties numbering fewer than 30 killed and wounded. Some Marines joked that it was more dangerous crossing the street back home than landing on Okinawa. The easy landing was exactly what General Ushijima had planned. He had withdrawn his forces from the beaches and northern Okinawa, concentrating them in the prepared positions of southern Okinawa, where terrain favored the defense. American forces would be allowed to land unopposed, then channeled into killing zones where every advantage belonged to the defenders. The strategy required patience and discipline that previous Japanese commanders had lacked. Ushijima possessed both qualities in abundance. American forces advanced rapidly across northern Okinawa, securing airfields and ports with minimal resistance. By April 4th, Marine units had reached the eastern coast, effectively cutting the island in half. The speed of the advance encouraged optimism that Okinawa might fall within weeks. Then, American patrols encountered the first elements of Ushijima's main defense line. The real battle for Okinawa was about to begin. The Shuri Line stretched across the narrowest part of southern Okinawa, anchored on hills and ridges that commanded every approach. Japanese engineers had spent months converting natural formations into interconnected fortresses. Cave systems housed artillery pieces that could fire on American positions, then withdraw into tunnels before counterfire arrived. Machine gun nests were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible approach route. Mortar positions were sited in reverse slopes, where they remained invisible until the moment they opened fire. Major assaults on the Shuri Line began in mid-April, with American forces attacking toward the town of Shuri itself. What followed was unlike anything American forces had experienced in the Pacific. Instead of banzai charges and quick victory or defeat, the fighting devolved into a grinding battle of attrition, reminiscent of World War I's Western Front. American forces would capture a hill after days of fighting, only to discover it was merely an outpost for another line of defenses beyond. Japanese defensive tactics had evolved far beyond the crude charges of earlier battles. Artillery fire was carefully coordinated with infantry counterattacks. Positions were connected by tunnels that allowed rapid reinforcement of threatened points. When American forces occupied a position during the day, Japanese troops would emerge from hidden tunnels after dark to reoccupy the same ground. Dawn would often find American units surrounded by enemies who seemed to have materialized from solid rock. The weather added its own torments to the struggle. Okinawa's spring rainy season began in early May, turning the battlefield into a sea of mud that made movement nearly impossible. Tanks bogged down in shell craters filled with water. Supply lines became impassable quagmires that required hours to traverse. Wounded men drowned in foxholes filled with rainwater. The rain washed away camouflage and filled caves with the stench of unburied dead. American casualties mounted alarmingly as the battle dragged into May. Units that had landed at full strength were reduced to skeleton crews within weeks. The 96th Infantry Division suffered thousands of casualties, a substantial portion of its original strength. The 7th Infantry Division lost nearly as many. Replacement troops arrived from the United States with minimal training and were thrown immediately into combat. Combat fatigue reached epidemic proportions as the stress of constant fighting broke down even veteran troops. Men who had fought across the Pacific without faltering suddenly found themselves unable to function. The sound of incoming artillery would send them into catatonic states. Some wandered away from their units in the middle of firefights. Others sat in foxholes, staring blankly at nothing, unable to respond to orders or enemy fire. General Buckner faced increasing pressure from Washington to accelerate the campaign. Each day, the battle continued meant more American casualties and delayed preparations for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. Naval commanders were particularly concerned about kamikaze attacks that were devastating the supporting fleet. Admiral Turner urged Buckner to attempt amphibious landings behind Japanese lines to break the stalemate. Buckner refused, arguing that such operations would only create additional casualties without decisive results. The kamikaze offensive reached its peak during the Okinawa campaign. 10 major Kikusui attacks were launched between April and June, each involving hundreds of suicide aircraft. American radar picket destroyers bore the brunt of these assaults, positioned 50 to 70 miles from the main fleet to provide early warning of Japanese attacks. These ships became floating targets that absorbed kamikaze attacks meant for larger vessels. 5 picket destroyers were sunk and 16 damaged during the campaign. The psychological impact of kamikaze attacks was as important as their physical damage. American sailors found themselves facing an enemy that sought death rather than victory. No amount of damage seemed sufficient to turn kamikaze aircraft away from their targets. Planes with wings shot off continued their dives. Pilots with fatal wounds maintained control long enough to crash into their targets. The normal rules of combat psychology simply didn't apply. American countermeasures evolved rapidly to meet the kamikaze threat. Combat air patrols were increased to provide overlapping coverage around the fleet. Anti-aircraft guns were modified with proximity fuses that detonated shells near their targets rather than requiring direct hits. Ships began using coordinated fire patterns that created walls of flak through which no aircraft could survive. But the most effective countermeasure was the systematic destruction of Japanese airfields by carrier strikes and B-29 raids. By late May, the grinding battle for Shuri had consumed both sides' reserves. American forces had fought their way to within artillery range of Shuri Castle, the symbolic heart of Japanese resistance. But Ushijima was already implementing the next phase of his strategy. Rather than make a final stand at Shuri, Japanese forces began a carefully planned withdrawal to prepared positions on the Kian Peninsula. The battle would continue for another month in terrain even more favorable to the defense. The withdrawal to the Kian Peninsula demonstrated the sophistication of Japanese planning. Most of the 32nd Army escaped the Shuri positions under cover of darkness and torrential rain. Rearguard actions delayed American pursuit, while the main force established new defensive lines. When American troops finally occupied Shuri on May 31st, they found empty positions and abandoned equipment. The enemy had vanished like smoke, only to reappear in even stronger positions to the south. The final phase of the Okinawa campaign was fought over terrain that seemed designed by nature for defensive warfare. The Kian Peninsula was a maze of coral ridges, deep valleys, and cave complexes that channeled attackers into predetermined killing zones. Hill 89 became the scene of particularly savage fighting as American forces struggled to dislodge Japanese defenders from fortified caves. Each cave had to be cleared individually with flamethrowers, explosives, and close combat that favored the defenders. General Buckner's frustration with the slow pace of operations led to increasingly dangerous personal behavior. The 10th Army commander made frequent visits to forward positions to observe the fighting firsthand. His staff repeatedly warned him about the dangers of such exposure, but Buckner insisted that commanders needed to see conditions their troops faced. On June 18th, while inspecting frontline positions, Buckner was killed by Japanese artillery fire. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed in the Pacific War. Lieutenant General Roy Geiger, a Marine aviator, assumed command of the 10th Army, the first Marine officer ever to command such a large ground force. Geiger immediately accelerated operations against the remaining Japanese positions. By June 21st, organized Japanese resistance had finally collapsed. General Ushijima and General Cho committed ritual suicide rather than face capture. The Battle of Okinawa was officially over. The human cost of Okinawa staggered both sides. American casualties totaled approximately 49,151, including over 12,500 dead and missing. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000, with civilian casualties estimated at 40,000 to 100,000 depending on definitions. The 32nd Army had been virtually annihilated. Only a few thousand Japanese soldiers surrendered during the entire campaign. Naval losses included dozens of Allied ships sunk or damaged by kamikaze attacks. But the strategic consequences of Okinawa extended far beyond the immediate casualties. American planners studying the campaign concluded that invading Japan would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties. If Japanese civilians fought with the same fanaticism as Okinawan defenders, the home islands could become a charnel house. President Harry Truman and his advisors began seriously considering alternative methods of forcing Japanese surrender. The lessons of Okinawa influenced American strategic thinking in the war's final months. The effectiveness of kamikaze attacks convinced naval commanders that conventional invasion might be prohibitively costly. The fanatical resistance of Japanese ground forces suggested that occupation of Japan would require years of brutal pacification campaigns. Most importantly, the Japanese willingness to sacrifice civilians demonstrated that normal diplomatic and military pressure might be insufficient to force surrender. Japanese leaders drew their own conclusions from the Okinawa campaign. The 32nd Army had delayed American forces for over 2 months while inflicting casualties that shocked the American public. Similar tactics applied to defending the home islands might make invasions so costly that America would seek a negotiated peace. Plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, became the template for Japan's final defense strategy. Every beach would be another Okinawa. Every city would be another Shuri. The psychological impact of Okinawa on American forces was profound. Veterans of the Pacific Campaign had never encountered resistance as determined and sophisticated as they faced on Okinawa. The Japanese had learned to fight American forces on more equal terms, neutralizing advantages in firepower and technology through superior positioning and tactics. More disturbing was the realization that Japanese forces were becoming more effective as the war progressed rather than weaker. For Japan, Okinawa represented both vindication and tragedy. The 32nd Army had proven that American forces could be stopped through proper planning and sacrifice. But the cost had been enormous. An entire army destroyed, thousands of civilians dead, and strategic positions lost that could never be recovered. The victory was Pyrrhic in the extreme, purchased with blood that Japan could no longer afford to shed. The technological innovations displayed during the Okinawa campaign pointed toward the future of warfare. Kamikaze attacks were the first systematic use of guided weapons in naval combat. American countermeasures included early radar-controlled gun systems and proximity-fused shells that would become standard in later conflicts. The coordination between air and ground forces reached levels of sophistication that set the pattern for modern combined operations. But the most significant innovation was invisible: the growing American conviction that atomic weapons might be necessary to end the war. In Washington, the Joint Chiefs of Staff reviewed casualty projections for Operation Downfall based on Okinawan experience. The numbers were staggering. American deaths might exceed those suffered in the entire European theatre. Japanese resistance could continue for years, even after successful invasion. The economic and social costs of such a campaign would dwarf anything America had previously undertaken. Alternative methods of forcing Japanese surrender suddenly became much more attractive. The Battle of Okinawa ended not with victory parades, but with grim planning for even greater slaughter. American forces controlled the island, but at a cost that made future operations appear almost impossible. Japanese forces had been destroyed, but their sacrifice had achieved its primary objective, demonstrating that invading Japan would be unacceptably costly. Both sides now faced a strategic impasse that conventional warfare seemed unable to resolve. The solution would come from the atomic laboratories of Los Alamos, rather than the beaches of Japan. As the Pacific burned with kamikaze fire and Okinawa's caves echoed with the screams of the dying, Europe's ancient battlegrounds witnessed the death throes of the Third Reich. While American Marines counted their dead on coral ridges 8,000 miles away, Soviet armies were crushing the last remnants of Hitler's empire in the mountains and valleys of the Balkans. The war that had begun with Nazi aggression against Poland would end with a desperate final gamble in the shadow of the Alps, where SS divisions and Hungarian levies would make their last stand against the Red Army's inexorable advance. But this wasn't just about military defeat. It was about the political future of Europe itself, and the price that millions of civilians would pay for Hitler's megalomaniacal dreams. The Balkans would become both graveyard and birthplace, where Nazi tyranny died and communist domination was born. Europe's forgotten front would become the graveyard where Hitler's thousand-year Reich finally bled to death. While the world's attention focused on Normandy beaches and Pacific atolls, a parallel war of savage brutality unfolded across the mountains and valleys of southeastern Europe. Here, in lands that had known conquest and resistance for centuries, the Wehrmacht would fight its final major offensive. Here, communist partisans would forge the iron fist that would rule half of Europe for the next 50 years. Here, the last of Hitler's mobile reserves would die in the Hungarian mud, leaving Berlin defenseless against Stalin's approaching legions. By summer 1944, the strategic situation in the Balkans had become a nightmare for German planners. Army Group South Ukraine, positioned in Romanian territory, risked complete severance from the rest of the German armies. The force faced isolation, along with remaining garrisons throughout the Balkans, cut off from their homeland by an advancing Red Army that grew stronger with each passing day. Hitler's obsession with holding every yard of conquered territory had created a strategic trap from which there was no escape. Marshal Rodion Malinovsky commanded the Second Ukrainian Front, a force that had been blooded in the great tank battles of Kursk and Stalingrad. Beside him, Marshal Fyodor Tolbukhin's Third Ukrainian Front represented the cutting edge of Soviet tactical evolution. These were no longer the crude peasant armies that had retreated in chaos before German panzers in 1941. They were mechanized juggernauts, equipped with American Lend-Lease trucks, Soviet 34 tanks, and artillery concentrations that could flatten entire cities. Most importantly, they were commanded by generals who had learned their trade in the hardest school imaginable. German and Romanian forces held positions along the Dniester River in what is now Moldova. On paper, the combined force appeared substantial, but both armies were hollow shells of their former strength, weakened by years of casualties and the gradual erosion of German industrial capacity. Romanian troops in particular had suffered enormous losses fighting alongside German forces on the Eastern Front. At home, Allied bombing raids were destroying the oil refineries that provided Germany with desperately needed petroleum products. Romania's commitment to the Axis cause had been wavering since the disaster at Stalingrad. Marshal Ion Antonescu had tied his country's fate to Hitler's star, but that star was clearly setting in the east. King Michael and his advisors were secretly negotiating with the Allies for a separate peace. The kingdom that had entered the war seeking territorial gains now faced the prospect of Soviet occupation. Stalin understood the political dimensions of the Balkan campaign as clearly as the military ones. Southeastern Europe was not just a battlefield, but a prize to be won for the communist cause. The Red Army's advance into the Balkans would determine whether these ancient lands fell under Soviet influence or remained aligned with the West. Churchill's attempts to establish significant Allied presence in the Balkans had largely failed. Now Stalin would claim his reward for bearing the burden of fighting Nazi Germany. The Second Jassy-Kishinev Offensive began on August 20th, 1944, with an artillery barrage that could be heard across the countryside. Thousands of guns concentrated their fire on German and Romanian positions along a narrow front. The bombardment continued for hours, systematically destroying communication lines, ammunition dumps, and command posts. When the guns finally fell silent, Soviet armies surged forward in a coordinated assault that overwhelmed the defenders. The collapse was sudden and devastating. Romanian units, already demoralized by years of fighting someone else's war, disintegrated under the Soviet onslaught. German forces tried to maintain cohesion, but they were too scattered to hold such an extended front. Soviet advances reached the Danube within days, trapping substantial German and Romanian forces in pockets that would be systematically reduced. The speed of the Soviet advance caught even experienced commanders by surprise. Tank spearheads penetrated deep behind Axis lines, cutting communication and supply routes. Entire divisions were being overrun before they could establish defensive positions. Romanian forces began surrendering en masse, their officers often joining Soviet-sponsored units formed from prisoners of war. On August 23rd, King Michael staged a coup against Marshal Antonescu, arrested the pro-German dictator, and announced Romania's withdrawal from the Axis. Within hours, Romanian forces were fighting alongside their former enemies against German troops. The betrayal, as Hitler saw it, sealed the fate of Army Group South Ukraine. With Romanian forces controlling key bridges and supply routes, German units found themselves cut off from ammunition and fuel. The pocket collapsed within days, yielding tens of thousands of prisoners. Bulgaria's defection followed the Romanian pattern with startling speed. As Tolbukin's forces crossed the Danube, the Bulgarian government decided to follow Romania's example. On September 8th, Bulgaria declared war on Germany, a decision that opened the entire southeastern flank to Soviet advance. German forces that had expected to find refuge in Bulgarian territory discovered instead that they were surrounded by new enemies. The political earthquake that followed these military disasters was felt throughout Hitler's alliance system. Hungary, Germany's most reliable satellite, suddenly found itself the next target on Stalin's list. Admiral Miklos Horthy, Hungary's regent, began secret negotiations with the Soviets for a separate armistice. But Hitler was not about to lose his last major ally without a fight. German intervention prevented Hungary's defection, deposing Horthy and installing a fascist puppet regime under Ferenc Szalasi. Soviet forces reached the outskirts of Budapest in early October 1944, but the Hungarian capital would not fall easily. General Karl Pfeffer Wildenbruch commanded a substantial garrison of German and Hungarian troops who had been ordered to hold the city at all costs. Hitler understood that losing Budapest would open the road to Vienna and ultimately to southern Germany itself. More importantly, Hungary's oil fields and industrial resources were among the last remaining assets that kept the German war machine functioning. The siege of Budapest became one of the war's most brutal urban battles. Unlike Stalingrad, where German forces had been the attackers, Budapest saw Wehrmacht units defending a city against Soviet assault. The irony was not lost on German veterans who had participated in the earlier battle. Now, they were the ones trapped in an urban fortress, fighting from building to building while their enemies controlled the surrounding countryside. Budapest's geography favoured the defenders. The Danube River divided the city into Buda and Pest, connected by bridges that could be demolished to prevent Soviet crossings. The hills of Buda provided excellent observation posts for artillery spotters. Centuries-old buildings offered natural fortifications that absorbed tremendous punishment before collapsing. Underground tunnels and sewers allowed defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to Soviet fire. Malinovsky's forces surrounded the city in December 1944, but reducing the pocket would require months of bloody fighting. Soviet artillery pounded German positions around the clock, reducing entire neighbourhoods to rubble. Tank attacks were met by German anti-tank teams armed with Panzerfausts, disposable rocket launchers that could destroy even heavy Soviet armour. Street fighting raged through the winter as both sides fed reinforcements into the meat grinder. The siege's human cost was staggering. Hungarian civilians were trapped between German defenders and Soviet attackers, with no safe haven in a city being systematically destroyed. Food supplies dwindled to starvation levels. Medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties from both military and civilian populations. The beautiful Danube capital that had been known as the Paris of the East was being transformed into a wasteland of shattered stone and twisted metal. Hitler's response to the crisis revealed both his strategic desperation and his continuing delusions about German capabilities. Rather than evacuating the doomed garrison, he ordered major reinforcements to break through Soviet lines and relieve Budapest. The 6th SS Panzer Army was transferred from the Western Front, despite urgent needs in the defence against Eisenhower's forces. SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, fresh from the failed Ardennes offensive, was given command of this final gamble. The transfer of elite SS divisions from the Western to the Eastern Front represented a fundamental shift in German priorities. Hitler was willing to weaken his defences against Anglo-American forces in order to hold Hungary and its oil resources. The decision revealed how desperate Germany's fuel situation had become. Without Hungarian crude oil, the Wehrmacht's remaining tanks and aircraft would be immobilized within weeks. The Balkans had become more important to German survival than the defense of the Reich itself. While regular German forces fought their conventional battles, a shadow war raged throughout the occupied Balkans between partisan forces and Axis troops. Yugoslavia had become a three-way battleground where communist partisans under Josip Broz Tito fought both German occupiers and rival Chetnik forces loyal to the exiled king. The British Special Operations Executive had been supporting resistance movements throughout the region, but their intervention came with political strings attached. Tito's partisans represented something new in the European resistance, a communist movement that was strong enough to control territory and govern populations. Unlike the fragmented resistance groups in France or Poland, the Yugoslav partisans had created an alternative state that challenged German occupation directly. They controlled substantial areas of mountain territory, operated their own facilities, and maintained diplomatic relations with the Allied powers. Most importantly, they were strong enough to survive without constant outside support. The SOE's relationship with Tito had been complicated by conflicting political objectives. British officers like Brigadier Fitzroy Maclean, Churchill's personal representative, understood that supporting the partisans meant empowering communist forces in post-war Yugoslavia. But Tito's fighters were among the most effective anti-German forces in the Balkans. 1. 0. Pragmatic military considerations overcame ideological concerns. By 1944, British aircraft were dropping substantial quantities of weapons and supplies to partisan forces. The partisan war had evolved into a sophisticated military operation that tied down substantial German forces. Multiple German and Bulgarian divisions were deployed in anti-partisan operations throughout Yugoslavia. These were troops that could have made a crucial difference at Normandy or on the Eastern Front. Instead, they were scattered across the Balkan mountains, fighting an enemy that melted away before major attacks, only to reappear behind German lines. The partisan campaign reached its climax in October 1944, when Belgrade fell to a combined force of Red Army troops and Tito's partisans. The capture of Yugoslavia's capital was both strategically and symbolically important. It severed German communications between forces in Greece and those in Hungary. More importantly, it demonstrated that communist forces could liberate territory and establish governments without Western assistance. The future of Eastern Europe was being decided by men with red stars on their caps. German Army Groups E and F, which had occupied Greece and Yugoslavia since 1941, now faced the nightmare scenario of fighting their way back to Germany through hostile territory. The withdrawal began in September 1944, as Soviet advances in Romania made their positions untenable. What followed was one of the longest fighting retreats in military history, a running battle through the mountains of the Balkans that cost both sides enormous casualties. The German retreat was harried every mile by partisan forces that had spent 3 years preparing for exactly this opportunity. Bridge demolitions channeled German columns into ambush sites. Sniper attacks picked off officers and specialists. Night raids disrupted rest and resupply operations. The psychological pressure was as destructive as the physical attacks. German soldiers never knew when the next bullet would come or from which direction. Meanwhile, Hitler was preparing his final gamble in Hungary. Operation Spring Awakening, Frühlingserwachen, would be Germany's last major offensive of the war. The plan was strategically sound: break through Soviet lines around Lake Balaton, relieve the Budapest garrison, and recapture the Hungarian oil fields. Success would provide Germany with desperately needed petroleum, while demonstrating that the Wehrmacht could still achieve victory. Failure would leave the Reich defenseless against the final Soviet assault. Dietrich's 6th SS Panzer Army represented experienced German armour. The 1st and 2nd SS Panzer Divisions were veteran units that had fought across Europe since the beginning of the war. Their equipment included the latest German tanks, King Tigers, that weighed 70 tons and mounted 88mm guns capable of destroying any Soviet armour. Supporting them were Hungarian units desperate to protect their homeland and German infantry divisions that understood this might be their last chance for victory. The offensive began on March 6, 1945, with a pre-dawn artillery barrage that illuminated the Hungarian countryside like daylight. For the first time in months, German panzers were advancing instead of retreating. Initial progress was encouraging as SS spearheads punched through Soviet defensive lines. Hungarian civilians emerged from hiding to welcome German soldiers as liberators rather than occupiers. For a brief moment, it seemed that German military prowess might prevail once more. But the Wehrmacht of 1945 was a shadow of the force that had conquered Europe 5 years earlier. Fuel shortages limited operational flexibility. Ammunition was carefully rationed. Most critically, there were no reserves to exploit initial successes. When Soviet forces regrouped and counterattacked, German spearheads found themselves isolated and surrounded. The spring thaw turned Hungarian roads into seas of mud that swallowed entire tank battalions. King Tigers that were unstoppable on solid ground became helpless targets when bogged down. Soviet artillery could range on immobilized German armor and destroy it at leisure. Air attacks by IL-2 Sturmovix added to the carnage as Luftwaffe fighters were nowhere to be seen. The offensive that was supposed to save Hungary instead sealed its fate. Tolbukin's counter-offensive began on March 16th with an artillery bombardment that exceeded even the opening barrage of the Soviet summer offensive. German forces had nowhere to retreat. Their fuel was exhausted, their ammunition depleted, and their morale broken by the failure of Spring Awakening. The 6th SS Panzer Army disintegrated under Soviet assault. With it died Hitler's final hope of avoiding total defeat. The collapse of German forces in Hungary opened the road to Vienna and southern Germany. Soviet spearheads raced westward, covering distances in days that had taken German forces weeks to traverse during their original advance. Austrian resistance crumbled as Hungarian defences had collapsed. By April 13th, Soviet forces were approaching Vienna, which would fall after heavy fighting that lasted into April 14th. The city that had been the capital of the Habsburg Empire for 6 centuries fell to communist forces after determined resistance. The political implications of the Soviet victory in the Balkans extended far beyond military considerations. Stalin's armies now controlled a continuous belt of territory from the Baltic to the Adriatic Sea. Communist governments were being established in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia. The Iron Curtain that Churchill would later describe was being forged in the fires of German defeat. Western hopes for a democratic Eastern Europe died in the ruins of Budapest and Vienna. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German blitzkrieg tactics, had become Army Chief of Staff after the July plot against Hitler. Guderian understood better than anyone that the war was lost and had been urging Hitler to seek a negotiated peace. The destruction of German forces in Hungary eliminated any possibility of defending the Reich against the final Soviet assault. When Guderian pressed this point too forcefully in a meeting with Hitler on March 28th, he was dismissed from his position. Truth had become treason in the collapsing Third Reich. The human cost of the Balkan campaign was enormous. German military casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, and captured. Soviet losses were substantial, though Stalin's regime never released accurate figures. Civilian casualties throughout the region were staggering as ethnic conflicts merged with ideological warfare. Entire populations were displaced, murdered, or enslaved in the chaos of collapsing empires and emerging nation-states. The massacre of Hungarian Jews represented one of the war's final genocidal spasms. Even as Soviet forces approached Budapest, SS units and Hungarian fascists continued the systematic murder of Jewish civilians. Adolf Eichmann personally supervised deportations that sent hundreds of thousands to Auschwitz and other death camps. The killing continued until Soviet troops physically liberated the remaining ghettos and camps. German defeat could not resurrect the dead or heal the wounds of racial warfare. The collapse of German power in the Balkans had strategic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate theatre. With Hungary's oil fields lost, German mechanized forces throughout Europe ground to a halt. Luftwaffe operations were curtailed by fuel shortages that left thousands of aircraft grounded. U-boats were forced to remain in port while their crews received infantry training. The Wehrmacht was being transformed from a mechanized army back into a foot-mobile force reminiscent of World War I. Soviet forces now controlled the southern approach to Germany, complementing their main advance through Poland toward Berlin. Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front was racing through Silesia toward the Elbe River, while Zhukov's First Belarusian Front prepared for the final assault on the German capital. The strategic situation had become hopeless. Germany was surrounded by enemies advancing from all directions, while her own resources dwindled toward zero. The psychological impact of the Balkan collapse was as important as the strategic consequences. German soldiers who had entered the war believing in their racial and cultural superiority were now fleeing before Slavic armies they had been taught to despise. The master race was being mastered by peoples Hitler had designated for extermination. Cognitive dissonance shattered morale more effectively than any enemy propaganda campaign. The Nazi worldview was collapsing along with the Nazi Empire. By April 1945, the Balkan Front had effectively ceased to exist as organized German resistance crumbled throughout the region. Scattered units continued fighting local actions, but these were isolated gestures rather than coordinated defense. The main German armies were fleeing westward, hoping to surrender to Anglo-American forces rather than face Soviet captivity. Behind them, they left a devastated landscape littered with the graves of empires and the seeds of future conflicts. The transformation of Eastern Europe was now inevitable. Stalin's vision of a communist buffer zone stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea was becoming reality through the simple expedient of military occupation. Democratic politicians who had survived the war in London exile would return to find their countries governed by men with Moscow training and Red Army backing. The liberation of Eastern Europe from Nazi tyranny was simultaneously its subjugation to communist dictatorship. Freedom had been replaced by a different form of servitude. The lessons of the Balkan campaign would influence post-war strategic thinking for decades. The effectiveness of partisan warfare demonstrated that occupation forces could be defeated by determined resistance movements with external support. The speed with which political alignments shifted showed how quickly military defeat could translate into ideological transformation. Most importantly, the campaign proved that peripheral theatres could determine the outcome of global conflicts. Hitler's empire had been mortally wounded, not in Berlin or Paris, but in the mountains of Yugoslavia and the plains of Hungary. The final act was now approaching. With German forces shattered in the Balkans and Soviet armies approaching Berlin, the Third Reich entered its death throes. Hitler retreated to his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing increasingly fantastical orders to armies that no longer existed. Around him, Nazi officials fled or sought accommodation with the advancing Allies. The Thousand-Year Reich was ending not with the glorious Gotterdammerung that Hitler had envisioned, but with the pathetic whimper of a failed gambler who had staked everything and lost. The Balkans had claimed their final victim, the Nazi dream of European domination. But the cost of that victory would echo through the corridors of power for the next half-century, as Stalin's empire rose from the ashes of Hitler's defeat. The war that had begun with the promise of freeing Europe from tyranny ended with half the continent under new masters. History's greatest crusade for human freedom had become its most tragic betrayal. 5 battlefields. 4 years. Between 70 and 85 million dead. The killing fields we've walked through tonight were more than military campaigns. They were crucibles where the modern world was forged in blood and steel. Each battle decided not just tactical outcomes, but the fate of nations and the course of human history. Hitler's West Wall was breached through a combination of Allied assaults, strategic bypasses, and the famous Remagen Bridge crossing. Leningrad was meant to starve into submission, but Russian endurance outlasted German cruelty. Guadalcanal became one of the first sustained Allied offensives that reversed Japanese expansion after Midway had crippled their naval power. Okinawa's staggering casualties were a major factor, alongside the Manhattan Project and Soviet entry into the Pacific, that influenced America's decision to use atomic weapons. The Balkans became the graveyard where Hitler's final reserves bled to death, leaving Berlin defenseless. These campaigns birthed innovations that would reshape warfare forever. While German V-weapons pioneered guided missile technology, Japanese kamikaze tactics presaged the psychology of precision strikes and extreme warfare methods that would echo through future conflicts. American industry learned to sustain combat operations across oceans, creating the logistical networks that would define superpower status. Soviet commanders perfected the art of deep battle, crushing entire army groups with coordinated hammer blows that would shape Cold War doctrine. But technology tells only part of the story. The real narrative belongs to individuals caught in history's meat grinder. To the Marine on Guadalcanal, who held Henderson Field with a handful of bullets and unlimited courage. To the Leningrad mother who fed her children wallpaper paste rather than watch them starve. To the German soldier retreating through Yugoslav mountains, pursued by partisans who had lost everything to Nazi occupation. Their sacrifices purchased our world with currency we can never fully comprehend. The victory they achieved created the post-war order we inherited. American industrial supremacy, forged in Pacific battles, would underpin decades of global leadership. Soviet conquest of Eastern Europe, paid for with an estimated 27 million dead, created the Iron Curtain that divided continents. The atomic shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki redefined human warfare itself. Liberation and occupation became indistinguishable as freedom wore different uniforms in different places. We call this the Good War because the alternative, Nazi victory, was unthinkably worse. But goodness measured in mass graves and ruined cities reveals the tragic complexity of human conflict. The generation that saved democracy did so by perfecting the machinery of industrial killing. They preserved civilization by nearly destroying it. The price of their victory echoes still. Every precision weapon carries metaphorical DNA from desperate wartime innovations. Every humanitarian intervention recalls partisan wars in Yugoslav mountains. Every refugee crisis mirrors the millions displaced when empires collapsed and nations were reborn. The world they died to create is the world we struggle to understand. Perhaps that is their greatest gift to us, not answers, but the burden of remembering. Of understanding that freedom's price is measured not in coins but in lives. Of recognizing that our choices today echo through tomorrow's history books. The dead cannot speak, but their silence thunders louder than any words we might offer in their memory.